The printer kicked on while I was still bent over the shift log, tired enough to keep losing my place on the page. The room had that same wrong feeling it always picked up late at night, cold near the panel, damp everywhere else. The printer had been quiet. Then it clicked, fed paper, and pushed out a narrow strip. South gauge verified, shift complete, G. Tate. I just stared at it. I hadn't gone south. I hadn't taken the last reading. I hadn't closed anything out. That was the part that got me, not the printer moving by itself. The station was already treating me like I belonged to that shift, and the only way this makes sense is if I go back to how that job started. A couple weeks earlier, I was back in Terrebonne Parish, sleeping in my aunt's spare room with a duffel bag on the floor and a start date circled on my phone calendar. I wasn't home because I had some big plan to stay. I was there because the certification program I'd lined up out of state didn't begin for another month, and I needed to get through that stretch without burning through what I had left. Aunt Denise Landry had the room, and I told myself that was all it was. A room. A few weeks. A place to land until my real life started moving again. She knew a guy who knew a guy at the parish water district. That was how most jobs got explained down there anyway. Somebody's cousin needed nights covered. Somebody had a nephew who'd quit. Somebody knew I could show up on time and probably not break anything expensive. Vernon Guidry was the name that kept coming up. He'd been at South Fork long enough that nobody ever said what he did in a fancy way. They just said he was out there. That was supposed to mean enough. The first morning Denise brought it up. She had coffee gone lukewarm in one hand and my application printout in the other. She didn't sound excited about it exactly. More like she was offering me the least bad option on the table. Vernon says it's easy work if you don't get curious, Aunt Denise said. She set the paper down and kept her thumb resting on the corner like she hadn't decided whether to slide it toward me or pull it back. The kitchen smelled like old coffee and dish soap and the damp that never really left houses that close to the Marsh. I was still half asleep, still in that blank stretch where you wake up and remember you're 24 and back in your aunt's house for reasons you don't want to explain to people from high school. You watch the levels, you write them down, and you come home, she told me. That's all I'm looking for, I said. That part was true. I didn't need meaningful work. I didn't need a future out of it. I needed a job I could do half awake without wrecking my back, or getting stuck there long enough for people to start asking whether I was staying for good. South Fork sounded like the kind of place nobody dreamed about and nobody bragged about, which was fine with me. Sit in a control room, watch the panel, log the readings, check the generator once a shift. Keep an eye on the water levels, call the district if something went wrong. It sounded dull in a way I could trust. The first drive out there started south of Houma and kept going. Once I got off LA 57 near Duloc, the road lost what little company it had left. The farther I went, the more it felt like the rest of the parish had stepped back and let the Marsh take over. Houses got thinner. Traffic went to nothing. The last bit of road looked less like it led to a workplace and more like it ended in whatever was waiting past the cattails. I remember having the radio on low at first, then realizing I'd turned it down without thinking, because there wasn't much to compete with anymore besides tire noise, engine hum, and that wet, standing smell coming in through the vents. Mud, salt, rotting grass, water that didn't move unless something made it. South Fork itself wasn't some shack leaning into the swamp. That was the first thing I noticed. It was a real station, concrete pad, metal siding, service lights, a control room that looked exactly like the kind of place where people watched numbers and signed forms and drank bad coffee on night shifts. There was a boardwalk running out behind it, gauges posted where they needed to be, a pump house off to one side, and a service dock sitting low over the dark water. It looked ordinary enough that I almost felt stupid for being relieved. Still, there was one thing that stuck with me right away. Nobody said Southside the way they said generator or panel or dock. They said it a little flatter, a little shorter. Like it was just another part of the station, but not one they felt like standing around talking about. Vernon did it too when I met him. He shook my hand, told me where I'd keep the log, showed me the panel, showed me the phone, showed me the breaker box, and when his eyes flicked toward the rear of the station, he moved on before I could ask what was back there besides exactly what I already knew was back there. At the time, I told myself that was nothing. Just local habits. Just old workers being weird about their routines. I was there to put in a few weeks, save what I could, and leave. That was the plan when I first drove out to South Fork, and for a little while, I actually thought that place was going to let me do exactly that. The first couple shifts were mostly Vernon showing me how boring the job was supposed to be. That was part of what made it easy to accept. If he'd come at me with stories or warnings right away, I probably would have written him off as another old guy trying to make a small job sound bigger than it was. Instead, he treated it like exactly what it looked like. A station that moved water when it had to, watched levels when it didn't, and kept enough paper behind every number so the district couldn't come back later asking who missed what. The control room was smaller than I expected the first time I stepped inside, but it had everything packed where it needed to be. The panel took up most of one wall, all indicator lights, switches, and readouts that meant nothing to me the first hour and started making sense by the end of the second shift. The paper log stayed on the desk under a plastic cover that had gone cloudy at the corners. Next to it sat the system printer, narrow and ugly and older than it should have been, the kind that fed out long strips of paper with a sound like it was chewing on something. The landline sat to the left of the console. No cordless, no fancy headset, just a beige phone with a coiled cord and a little scratch near the receiver like somebody had once dropped it hard and kept using it anyway. Behind the station was the rear door leading out to the boardwalk. That walk ran over the water and marsh grass toward the gauges, with the north side the easier one to read from where the boards widened near the marker posts. The south side sat farther out at a slightly worse angle, where the dark under the walk felt thicker even in daylight. Off to one side of the building was Pump House 2, a separate structure with an inspection window set in the door and a concrete strip leading up to it. On the other side was the service dock, low and plain, where a skiff could tie up if somebody needed to come in from the water. None of it looked dramatic. It looked municipal. That was probably why it got under my skin later. Places like that aren't supposed to hold on to anything except damp and paperwork. Vernon walked me through the shift the same way every time. First panel check, then compare the current water level readings against the last entry in the log. Make the new entry clean. Time, level, notes if needed, initials. Check the printer output if the system kicked anything over on its own. Step out for generator check at the marked time. Listen for anything in the pump houses that sounded off, but don't start inventing problems where there weren't any. If the reading stayed inside the normal range, the whole night could pass with almost nothing happening besides pen on paper, the hum of the building, and the occasional radio call from district. That first radio check came while I was still trying not to look like I was memorizing where everything was. South Fork, radio check, Marlene said over the radio. Reading you fine, I said. Her voice had no extra in it. No local warmth, no small talk, no asking how my first night was going. She sounded like a woman who had 5 things happening at once and no interest in making any of them personal. That actually made me feel better. If the district contact had sounded nervous or overly friendly, I would have noticed. Instead, she just logged that I existed and moved on. Vernon gave the smallest nod like that was one more box checked. By the end of the second shift, I had the timing down well enough not to keep checking my watch every 10 minutes. I knew where the flashlight stayed, where the spare forms were, where the extra pens jammed into the drawer like to catch on the wood when you pulled too hard. I knew the generator housing gave off a faint hot metal smell, even when everything was fine. I knew the floor by the rear door always felt cooler through the soles of my boots. I knew the printer sometimes clicked once for no reason and then went still again. Small stuff, work stuff. The kind of details you notice because your body gets there before your mind does. There were a couple things I noticed because they didn't fit as neatly. Vernon never lingered by the rear door. He'd open it if he needed to, step out if the check called for it, then come back in and let it swing shut right away. He never stood there with it cracked while talking, never leaned in the frame for air, never rested a hand on it while thinking. He was too practical a man for habits that didn't come from somewhere. The logbook had its own oddity. Most of it was worn the same way, pages softened at the edges, corners bent, carbon copies tucked behind the cleaner sheets. Then there was one older section in the middle that looked different. Same form, same headings, but newer paper. Replaced paper. I noticed it because the pages were whiter and the holes along the side weren't frayed like the rest. When I glanced at it, Vernon turned the book just enough to bring the current page back in front of me without making a thing out of it. I didn't ask, partly because I figured it was some boring record-keeping reason, and partly because I needed the job to stay boring. I needed the money. I needed to get to my program start date without having to borrow from Denise or admit to myself that I'd drifted back home with no real plan besides waiting. There's a kind of shame to being in between things too long. I could feel it every time I left my boots by her back door, every time I heard her leave for work before I went to bed after a night shift. This place wasn't my future. It was just supposed to get me to it. On the third night, after we'd done the panel check and gone over the next reading time, Vernon stood by the desk, looked toward the rear door, and finally said the first thing that made the job feel a little less ordinary. That south walk stays slick even when it looks dry. He said it like a man talking about loose wiring or a bad hinge, not dramatic, not mysterious, just something I was supposed to remember because it might matter later. Then he reached for the log, flattened the page with one hand, and I could tell from the way he paused there that he was about to start telling me the parts of the job nobody had put on the application. He didn't say any of it like he was about to let me in on some dark local secret. That was what kept me from brushing it off right away. If Vernon had lowered his voice or tried to make me lean in, I probably would have laughed later in my truck and told myself I was working with one more parish guy who'd spent too many years out in the marsh and started making rules for the weather. Instead, he kept moving. He checked the panel, straightened the pen beside the log, reached down to make sure the landline cord wasn't caught under the edge of the desk, and talked like he was covering the last practical things before I started taking shifts without him standing over my shoulder. Vernon kept his eyes on the panel. After midnight, you read north. South can wait for daylight. At first, that just sounded like one more old worker preference. Some people liked doing things the way they'd always done them and built a whole religion out of routine. I figured maybe the south marker was harder to see at night, or the angle was worse, or he'd had enough new guys slip on the boards that he'd started cutting corners where he could. Then he stepped over to the open log, put one finger on the last recorded reading, and tapped the empty line waiting under it. If south comes in lower, circle it. Don't fix it, he said. That was the first one that made me really look at him, not because I believed there was anything wrong with the place yet, but because it cut against the whole point of keeping a station log. Up to then, everything he'd taught me was about clean paperwork and consistent numbers. If something looked off, you checked it. If something didn't match, you figured out why. That was how jobs like that worked. You didn't leave a bad number sitting there on purpose. He must have seen it on my face, because he finally turned the book enough for me to see the margin where a couple older entries had been circled the same way. Just circles around the figures, no corrections, no neat explanation clipped beside them. He told me that if the south number came in more than 6 inches lower than north after midnight, I was supposed to log the time, circle it, and use the landline. Not the radio, the landline. Call district direct, give them the reading, and leave it exactly as it was. No pencil scratch-outs, no trying to make the page look cleaner than the station was giving me. That part stuck in my head because it was so specific, it stopped sounding superstitious and started sounding expensive. Rules get that exact when somebody had to learn them after something went wrong. From there, he moved on like none of it needed reaction from me. He crossed the room and tipped his head toward the window in the door of Pump House 2. It was just a square of reinforced glass, cloudy around the edges from age and weather, the sort of thing I wouldn't have looked at twice if he hadn't drawn my attention there. He looked toward Pump House 2. If that glass fogs from the inside, leave it alone. I glanced past him at the building. The machines in there were loud when they ran and warm, even when they weren't doing much. I told myself there were plenty of ordinary reasons glass could look strange at night. Heat difference, humidity, bad seal. But Vernon kept going. If the glass turned white from inside while the reading stayed normal, I wasn't to open the door. I was supposed to kill the hall light outside, come back into the control room, and not look at that glass a second time during the same shift. Not, don't stand there for 10 minutes. Not, don't stare too long. Don't look a second time. He said it the way you'd talk about a valve you already knew was sticking, like he was sparing me the trouble of learning the hard way. Then he touched the top of the printer with the back of his fingers, like he was checking whether it had been running. If the printer spits anything but system log, don't read past the first line, he told me. That one landed even harder than the others. The printer was right there, ugly, old, harmless looking. It had spent the last few shifts doing exactly what machines like that always did, which was mostly nothing until it had some dull district update or automated readout to cough up. He told me if it ever printed anything off pattern, I was to tear the strip free, lay it face down in the metal drawer to the left of the console, and unplug the printer until daylight. Not later. Not after I finished a few other things. Right then. He even showed me the drawer, which had a scuffed bottom and a dent in one corner like somebody had slammed it shut too hard, more than once. That was another thing I noticed. He had a place for every part of it. Not just the printer, not just the paper, the drawer, the direction it went in, face down. I still didn't say anything. I think part of me didn't want to ask because asking would have made me sound nervous, and part of me didn't want to hear the answer in case it turned the whole job from boring to something I'd have to think about outside work hours. I was there to fill shifts and get paid, not start sleeping worse over a place I had no intention of staying in. Vernon checked his watch, then looked toward the front side of the building where the service dock sat low over the water. And if there's a skiff at the dock that nobody logged, it can sit there till morning. That one sounded flat-out stupid to me for about half a second, then immediately less stupid than I wanted it to. It was too easy to imagine some fisherman tying off where he shouldn't, or some district hand coming in from the water without calling ahead. But Vernon didn't say, maybe it's nothing. He said if there was a skiff near dawn and nobody had logged it, I wasn't to go check it, wasn't to turn on the dock light, and wasn't to touch the line. Just keep the front curtain shut and stay away from the windows. He said it all in the same tone he'd used for the generator checks, which was somehow worse than if he'd sounded scared. By then I was standing there with my arms folded without meaning to, trying not to look like I was taking any of it too seriously and failing at that a little. Why all of that? I asked. Vernon took a second before answering. Because South Fork doesn't always know when a shift is over. That didn't sound like a line he'd practiced. It sounded like the shortest version of a longer thing he was tired of carrying around. He went back to the log, flipped one page, then another, and stopped with his hand resting over a section he didn't let me study for long. He didn't look at me when he added it. Milton learned that the hard way. That was all he gave me. No story, no dramatic pause, no explanation about what exactly Milton had done or what had happened after. Just a name, dropped into the room like it had already been there before I got hired. I remember wanting to ask more, and not liking that I wanted to. I remember telling myself there was probably a normal version of all of it if I pulled at the right thread. Some accident, some paperwork mess, some guy who'd screwed up a reading and fallen in the water drunk for all I knew. But I also remember the way I checked the printer before I sat down that night, and the way I noticed the rear curtain for the first time, and the way the landline suddenly felt more important than a phone in a place that quiet ought to have. When Vernon handed me the pen and told me to initial the next line if the reading stayed steady, I took it like I was still humoring an old man. The truth was, I'd already started memorizing every word. My first solo shift stayed quiet long enough that I started feeling stupid for how much room Vernon's rules had taken up in my head. That was probably what I needed. If something had gone wrong the second he pulled out of the lot, I would have been halfway out the door myself, telling Denise in the morning that the whole place was run by people with too much time and not enough fresh air. Instead, it settled into the kind of night I'd expected from the start. The panel held steady. The building gave off the same low hum it always did. Every sound found its place after a while. Air unit, wiring buzz, a pump kicking on somewhere deeper in the station and then leveling back out. The kind of noise you stop hearing once your body decides it's safe. I made my first few checks clean. Logged the north reading, then the other side while it was still before midnight, initialed the page, checked the generator housing, came back in, and sat with the same bad coffee smell in the room and the same damp chill near the rear door. I remember looking at the printer once, almost to prove to myself I wasn't nervous, and feeling a little embarrassed that I'd even done that. A little after 12 a.m., I was at the desk going back over the last line I'd written when I caught the light at the end of the boardwalk blink once through the edge of the rear window. I didn't think much of it at first. Out there, lights did weird things sometimes. Bugs crossed in front of them. Moisture got into housings. Wind could make a bad fixture twitch if it was already half on its way out. Then it blinked a second time. I looked straight at the panel. Nothing. No fault light, no drop, no alarm. No reason for anything outside to be acting up. That was the first moment Vernon's voice stopped sounding like old man routine and started sounding like something I had already agreed to follow without knowing it. I just stood there for a second, with my hand still on the edge of the desk, staring from the clean panel to the dark rectangle of the rear glass and back again. My normal instinct was to step outside, walk the boards, and make sure the light wasn't about to die completely. That was the sensible thing. A light issue was a work issue. You checked it. Instead, I opened the log and wrote shorelight only exactly the way he'd told me to. The phrase looked wrong on the page, too vague for a station record, like something somebody scribbled to remind himself to ask later. I put the time next to it, set the pen down, crossed to the rear window, and pulled the curtain shut. Once that fabric was drawn across the glass, the room felt smaller right away. Not scarier exactly, just cut off in a way I hadn't noticed before. I stayed inside after that and tried to act like I was doing it because the rule made practical sense. Wet boards, bad visibility, no reason to take a walk over water just for a light if the system itself wasn't showing a fault. That was a version of it I could live with. I repeated that to myself while I checked the next numbers. North came in first, normal enough, a little movement, nothing dramatic. I wrote it down, then leaned to get the south side at the angle I'd been shown from inside. I cleaned the glass with the side of my thumb first because I was already halfway expecting the red to be harder. When I got the number, I honestly thought I'd read it wrong. I checked north again, then south again. South was lower by more than 6. I kept staring at the page like maybe the last entry would rearrange itself if I looked long enough. It made no sense. Not the kind of no sense that meant the world had cracked open. The kind that made you think of ordinary stupid things first. Mud on the marker, bad angle from inside, light glare, some weird mismatch in what the station was pulling versus what was visible from the board. Maybe I'd copied north wrong. Maybe the south marker was harder to read through the dark than I wanted to admit. My pen was already in my hand and I could feel the impulse to smooth it out before it existed anywhere official. Just make it match, keep the page clean, fix it on the next check if it straightened itself out. Instead, I sat there with the tip of the pen hovering over the log while Vernon's instructions came back to me in the exact order he'd given them. Circle it. Log the time. Landline. Don't fix it. I circled the number harder than I meant to. The ink dug into the paper enough that I could feel it through the page under it. Then I reached for the phone. The landline always seemed louder than it should have been in that room. Even the dial tone felt too solid. I watched the empty printer while I waited for the call to go through, and somewhere in the few seconds before she picked up, I told myself I was going to sound ridiculous, explaining a reading discrepancy like it was some kind of emergency. "I've got south lower than north by more than 6, I said into the landline. "Circle it and leave it," Marlene said. No pause, no rustle of paperwork, no asking me to repeat myself. I looked at the circled entry in front of me and felt my stomach drop just a little. "You want me to recheck?" I asked. She didn't take long. No. That was what bothered me. Not that she believed me, not even that she had an answer ready. It was how fast the answer came, like I'd stepped into the middle of something that had already been happening long before I got there. She didn't sound surprised. She didn't sound annoyed. She didn't sound like a woman hearing a weird report in the middle of the night. She sounded like somebody hearing the right kind of wrong. After I hung up, I sat there for a few seconds with my hand still on the receiver. The room hadn't changed. The panel was steady. The log was open. The printer was quiet. Nothing had moved except me. But the place didn't feel boring anymore, and that was a bigger shift than I wanted to admit. On my way back from checking the generator later, I made the mistake of glancing toward Pump House 2. Just once. The inspection glass looked normal at first. Then I caught what might have been a pale haze near the center of it, faint enough that I could have blamed it on reflected light or a film of moisture, or my own tired eyes. I didn't stop walking long enough to prove myself right or wrong. I went back inside, shut the door, and stood there with one hand still on the knob. Up until that night, I'd been treating Vernon's rules like the kind of thing you follow because it's easier than arguing. After that, I understood something I hadn't wanted to. Whether I believed the reason behind them or not, the rules weren't there for flavor. They were there because somebody had needed them before I ever showed up. The first bad reading should have been the kind of thing I forgot by the next shift. I wanted one clean night, one boring night. Instead, the place started doing something worse than getting dramatic. It started repeating itself, not every night. That would have been easier, honestly. If it happened the same way every shift, I could have built my whole head around it, but the pattern was there. That was the part I couldn't shake. The beacon at the end of the rear walk would blink wrong with the panel still showing clean. The south side would come in low enough to circle again. Then I'd get one quiet stretch where nothing happened except the hum of the building and the scratch of my pen. And I'd start talking myself back down just in time for something else to slip a little sideways. I stopped standing near the rear door unless I had to. I noticed that before I admitted it to myself. My body just quit choosing that side of the room when there was no reason to be there. If I had paperwork to go over, I did it closer to the console. If I was waiting on a check time, I leaned against the filing cabinet instead of the back wall. I started pulling the rear curtain sooner, too. Sometimes right after midnight if the dark outside looked too flat through the glass. That felt dumb the first time I did it. Then it started feeling normal, which was worse. The numbers kept doing it. Not every check, but often enough that the circles in the log began to catch my eye the second I opened the book. It got to where I'd turn to a fresh page and already feel my shoulders tighten because I knew there was a good chance I'd be drawing another one before the shift was over. I still had rational explanations ready every time. Mud on the marker, light angle, a bad read from inside, a strange difference in what I was seeing versus what the station should have been showing. I cycled through them over and over because I needed one of them to hold. The problem was they didn't explain why District never sounded surprised. The place had other ways of getting under my skin. Pump House 2 was the worst of them because it stayed just this side of deniable. Most nights the inspection glass was exactly what it should have been, dark and ordinary, reflecting the weak light from the strip over the door. Then once in a while I'd catch that whitening in it. Not a shape, not a face. Nothing I could point at later and swear was impossible. Just the inside of the glass turning pale from within, like breath on cold glass, except too even and too still. Every time it happened, I checked the readings first. They stayed normal. Load stable, temperature where it should be. Nothing on the panel to justify a problem in there. That was how the rules started changing shape in my head. They stopped sounding like weird local instructions and started sounding like a system somebody had built around something they couldn't explain, but had learned how to survive. I still wasn't ready to say I believed any of it. What I was losing was confidence in my own certainty. The printer got bad in smaller ways first. Once or twice I'd come back from the generator check and find it warm at the top, even though it hadn't printed anything. Another time it fed half a strip of blank paper and stopped. No text, just paper hanging there like the thing had started to say something and changed its mind. I started reacting to that machine before it even did anything. One dry click from inside it and my shoulders would lock up. One little feed sound and my hand would go straight to the edge of the desk. That was new for me. I'd done night work before. Warehouses, freight docks, jobs where machines clanked and popped and you learned to ignore most of it. This was different. It felt like waiting for something to clear its throat. Denise started noticing before I wanted her to. I'd come in at dawn, shower, lie down, and still wake up feeling like I'd never really stopped working. My sleep got chopped up. Not nightmares exactly. More that half-awake kind where every sound in the house pulled me back to the surface too fast. Her dog moving in the hall, pipes ticking, a truck door shutting outside. I got shorter with her too, which I hated, because she hadn't done anything except give me a place to stay and keep acting like that was no big deal. One afternoon, I tossed my work shirt over the chair in the spare room and went to rinse my coffee mug. She stopped in the doorway, picked the shirt up by 2 fingers, and wrinkled her nose a little. Aunt Denise looked at my shirt on the chair. "You smell like that place even after you shower." "It's a pump station," I said. I said it too fast. We both heard that. The shirt did smell bad, but not in any clean industrial way. It held the marsh, damp wood, old standing water, that sour green smell that sticks in your nose after you've been around it too long. Denise didn't argue with me. She just dropped the shirt back on the chair and kept looking at me like she was deciding how much she wanted to push. In the end, she didn't. That almost made it worse. The mistake came on a night that felt ordinary right up until it didn't. I'd already had one wrong blink from the beacon and one circled south reading, which by then was almost enough to pass for routine. Later on, stepping back inside from the generator housing, I looked toward Pump House 2 and saw the glass go pale. Same as before. White from the inside even, clean, no smear to it. I kept moving because that was what I was supposed to do. Then I stopped inside the door and looked again. It wasn't even a long second look. That's the part that still bothers me. It was maybe 2 seconds, maybe less. Just long enough to check whether I'd really seen it, and long enough for the pale white to seem a shade thicker than it had the first time. Then I shut the rear door harder than I meant to and went straight back to the control room. Nothing dramatic happened. No alarm, no crash, nothing inhuman reaching at the glass. That almost let me convince myself I'd gotten away with it. I sat down at the desk, pulled the log closer, and froze. There was already a line printed across the next log strip. Not handwritten. Printed. Faint, but there. Timestamp, category field. The kind of line the system put down before an entry. The problem was the time on it didn't fit. It was ahead of where I should have been by enough that I knew it wasn't me losing track by a minute or two. I checked my watch, then the panel clock, then the strip again. They didn't line up. It looked like the room had moved forward without me, or the printer had decided I'd already been there longer than I had. I tore the strip off and stared at it. My mouth had gone dry in that dumb physical way that doesn't care whether you found a good explanation yet. I looked at the printer and felt that same stupid mix of anger and nerves you get when a machine at work starts misbehaving, and you know damn well a machine isn't supposed to have timing. The next chance I got, I told Vernon as much as I could without making myself sound like I was coming apart. He listened the whole way through. Didn't interrupt, didn't nod much either. Just stood with one hand braced on the desk and his attention fixed on me like this was something he'd been waiting to hear me say. Vernon listened without interrupting. "Did you look twice?" I didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the door. "Then don't do it again." That was all the comfort I got. No speech about nerves, no easy out. Just the confirmation that the wrong question wasn't what I'd seen. It was whether I'd broken the rule exactly the way he thought I had. That got to me more than I wanted to show. I stood there a few seconds longer, then looked at the printer because by then I was doing that even when I didn't mean to. "You ever have that printer act up on you?" I asked. Vernon let that sit there. Not in a way I wanted to keep reading. He went right back to the log after that, which was his way of ending the subject. But the answer stayed with me all through the next shift. The printer didn't have to do much anymore to get my attention. A click, a feed sound, a little warmth at the top when it should have been cold. It felt like it was waiting on something, and I had the bad feeling that whatever it was waiting for had started getting closer to my name. By then, the thing wearing me down wasn't one big event. It was the way the station kept taking ordinary work and bending it just a little out of line. Enough that I couldn't trust my first read on anything anymore. Enough that I started double-checking my own hands, my own watch, my own memory of where I'd been standing 5 minutes earlier. That kind of strain sneaks up on you. You don't feel yourself breaking. You just notice one night that you're holding your breath every time the printer clicks and standing farther from the rear door than you used to. The weather turned on me some that week too. Not a storm, not anything dramatic. Just enough wind and water movement through the marsh that district had reason to care more about the numbers. That mattered because it gave Marlene a clean, practical excuse to stop tolerating bad readings sitting in the log. The first couple times I called them in, she let them sit exactly the way Vernon had told me to leave them. Then, one shift she came over the radio sounding tighter than usual, like she'd had the same conversation with 3 other places and was done with all of us. "I need a confirmed number, not a guess," Marlene said over the radio. I was standing at the desk with the rear curtain open, farther than I should have had it, trying to catch the south marker at a better angle without stepping outside. North was easy enough. South was low again. Not wildly low, not some impossible drop, just enough below north to scrape that same spot in the back of my head, the same stupid circle waiting on the page before I even drew it. "Vernon told me not to go south after midnight," I said. She took a second before answering. "Vernon doesn't run the district." That landed harder than I expected. Not because she was wrong. She wasn't. The station existed to do a job, and from her end, numbers that didn't line up were still numbers that didn't line up. She was the one getting calls from above her, putting reports together, trying to explain why one station kept feeding back discrepancies no one was resolving. There was a part of me that understood that. A bigger part than I wanted. It's easy to make somebody the bad guy once you're scared. Harder when they sound like exactly what they are, which was a person trying to keep a system working. Still, the way she said it made the room feel smaller. "You want me out on that walk?" I asked. "I want the station log to match the station," she said. That was the whole difference between her and Vernon right there. Vernon talked like a man who'd decided some parts of the job weren't worth touching anymore. Marlene talked like every loose number had to be brought back into line because that was what the district paid all of us to do. Both of them made sense. That was what made it bad. I didn't go all the way out. Not then. I told myself there was a line between doing my job and doing something I'd already been warned about, and I was still on the safe side of it. But I pushed closer than I should have. I stayed by the rear door too long. I pulled the curtain wider and left it open while I leaned for a better look. I even stepped out just far enough to put one boot on the first stretch of the boards, telling myself that wasn't really the walk, not in the way Vernon meant it, just enough to improve the angle, just enough to prove I still had some say in what I was doing out there. The boards were damp through the sole of my boot even though they looked dry. That got me right away. Not because it was impossible. Nothing stayed really dry around the marsh. But the sensation hit too close to Vernon's exact words, and I felt my chest tighten in that fast, irritating way it does when something you've been trying not to believe starts sounding smarter than you. I stepped back inside and shut the door. I circled the number instead, but something had changed by then because I knew I hadn't followed the rule cleanly. I'd argued with it, I had edged around it, and the station seemed to notice things like that. Later that same shift, I caught movement at the front side of the building that didn't make sense. Not big movement, just the kind that makes you look twice before your mind fills it in. I was halfway across the room when I realized what I was seeing through the narrow break at the front curtain. A skiff. Low in the water, tied at the service dock. I stopped dead and stared at it, trying to make my eyes tell me something normal. Maybe District had sent somebody without warning. Maybe some local idiot had decided the dock was a convenient place to tie off for a few minutes. Maybe it had been there longer than I thought, and I'd just failed to notice because I'd been too wrapped up in the rear side and the log and the phone calls. I went straight to the handoff notes, then the current page, then the prior page. Nothing. No mention, no boat, no expected arrival, no line in the log that would let me set my shoulders down again. I kept the front curtain where it was. I didn't touch the dock light. I didn't go to the window. But the whole station felt tilted after that, like the place had picked another point around me and was waiting to see whether I'd break on that side too. A little later, I made the mistake of looking toward Pump House 2. The inspection glass didn't just fog this time. It went white clear across, the whole center of it gone pale in one flat sheet. And the way it sat there was what got me. It wasn't random. It looked occupied. Not by a face or a body I could point at afterward, but by the absence of empty space. Like someone was standing in there where a man ought to stand, close enough behind the glass to own it. The readings stayed steady. The machinery never surged. The panel gave me nothing to justify what I was seeing. I killed the hall light without thinking and went back to the desk so fast I almost caught my shin on the corner of the chair. My mouth had that dry metal taste again. I could feel my pulse in the back of my neck. Even then, I still wasn't ready to say ghost or anything else stupid and clean like that. What I knew was simpler. The rules worked too well for me to keep pretending they were just habits. That was also the night the printer quit pretending to act like a normal machine. It started with a feed sound while I was nowhere near it. Then a strip came out, longer than the usual system line, and stopped crooked against the tray. I stood there looking at it for a second before I remembered not to read too far. The top line wasn't a format I recognized. No station code where it should have been. No standard heading. Just the same ugly type, lined up wrong, telling me the south side was still waiting on verification. I tore it off before I could see what came under it and laid it face down in the metal drawer like Vernon had told me. My fingers were clumsy enough that the paper caught on the edge and bent. I unplugged the printer right after that and stood there listening to the room, half expecting something to object. Nothing did. The building just kept humming like it had all night. That should have been enough to make me leave before dawn and never come back. I know that now. At the time, the thing that kept me in the chair was the same stupid thing that keeps people in bad jobs all over the country every day. I told myself I needed one more clear answer before I blew up my own routine. One more clean piece of proof. Not folklore, not caution, not my nerves. Something I could point to. So I went digging in the older records. The replace section Vernon had turned away from me before was still in the cabinet under the desk. Same forms, cleaner pages, older dates. I found Milton Hebbert's name faster than I should have, maybe because part of me had already been looking for it every time I opened the book. What got me wasn't one dramatic entry, it was the pattern. Circled south readings after midnight, notes written shorter and rougher as the shift went on, one mention of the rear beacon, then a gap, then system timestamps that didn't sit right with the handwriting around them. It wasn't identical to mine, not close enough to be ridiculous, but it was close enough to make my skin go cold anyway. The order was wrong in the same places. The pressure points were the same. The station had started him in the same spots it was starting me. I remember sitting there with one thumb pressed against the edge of the page and feeling something inside me go still. Not panic. Worse than panic. Recognition. Panic at least gives you motion. It felt like I was seeing where it had been steering me the whole time. I tried Vernon once that night from the landline and got nothing. No answer at home if he was even there, no call back, no message through district. Whether he was off, asleep, or keeping himself well clear of the place for his own reasons, I was on my own with it. Toward the end of the shift, I went to the front side again and forced myself to look through the slit in the curtain. The skiff was still there. Later, staring at the dock, I said into the empty room, "That skiff wasn't here when I started." Nobody answered, and that was answer enough. That was when the last of my ordinary doubt gave way. Not because I'd seen too much to deny. I still hadn't seen anything I could explain cleanly to another person without sounding half crazy. It was because the order of it all had stopped feeling random. The bad readings, the pressure from district, the rear walk, the printer, the dock, the old records. None of it was just showing up around me. It was arranging me, moving me one step at a time toward the same points Milton had hit before he disappeared out of his own shift. Up until then, I'd been thinking about the station like it was a place where wrong things happened. By the end of that night, I understood something colder than that. It wasn't just letting things happen around me. It was using the job itself, the procedures, the pressure to verify, the need to make the log match the building, to walk me into the same sequence it had already run once before. When I got back from that shift, daylight was already pushing through the cheap blinds in the spare room, and everything I'd lined up for myself looked smaller than it had the week before. My folder from the training program was still on the dresser. Start date, orientation sheet, housing address, deposit confirmation. It should have made me feel steadier seeing all of that. Instead, it just looked like proof that my life had started moving one way, while the job kept dragging at me from the other. I'd been counting the shifts without really admitting I was counting them, just the way you do when you're close to getting through something. A few more nights, a little more money, one clean exit. I could feel the line from where I was to where I was supposed to be next, and I hated that the station had started feeling like the only thing with enough weight to pull that line sideways. I tried to sleep. Didn't really. I lay there in my underwear with the fan turning in the corner and the marsh smell still sitting in my nose like I'd brought the place home inside my head. Every time I drifted off, I snapped back up, thinking about the printer or the dock or the way Milton's log had started going wrong in the same order mine had. Not the same details, the same sequence. That was what I couldn't let go of. If it had all just been random bad nights, I could have quit and called it a bad fit. But once I saw the pattern in the old records, quitting stopped feeling simple. It started feeling like walking away from a thing that already knew where to find me. I got up before noon and sat at Denise's kitchen table with my coffee going cold while I checked the numbers in my bank app twice. Deposit paid. Enough left to get through the week if nothing slipped, not enough to start eating lost shifts. That was the problem. That night at the station, I walked in already tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. The room looked the same. Panel, desk, printer, log, same ugly little building trying hard to pass for ordinary. I did the checks, wrote the entries, kept my eyes off the rear side longer than I wanted to, and tried to work like a guy who still believed this was just a bad stretch in a bad place. I made it maybe an hour before the printer moved. It didn't spit a full strip all at once, just started feeding paper slow, like it was thinking about it. I was on my feet before I even knew I'd moved. My hand was already going to the plug when I looked down and caught the first line. Not system code, not station headings, not anything from a valid report template. It was the name of the program I was supposed to start in 3 weeks. I tore the strip free so fast I bent it in the middle. I should have dropped it face down right then, the way Vernon had told me to do with anything that wasn't system log. Instead, I looked one line lower. That was my mistake. Below the program name was the orientation date. Below that was the mailing address I'd entered when I sent in my deposit. And under that, in the same ugly printer type the station used for maintenance alerts and level records, was the exact dollar amount still sitting in the account I'd been guarding to get out of there. I felt that in a different place than the rest of it. The bad readings, the dock, the glass, even the old records with Milton's name in them, those all belonged to the job. They were about the station, about the shift, about the wrongness inside that place. This was something else. This reached past where I worked and got a hand around the part of me that still thought I was on my way to becoming someone else. I unplugged the printer and shoved the strip face down in the drawer, but it was too late for that to matter. I'd already seen it. My hands felt weak in that aggravating physical way they do when fear hits before your thoughts catch up. I sat back down and stared at the closed drawer, trying to think of one reasonable explanation that didn't sound pathetic the second I formed it. Maybe District had access to personnel files. Maybe someone had entered my emergency contact paperwork somewhere stupid. Maybe Vernon had mentioned something to somebody and it had drifted back around in the worst possible way. I ran through every version of it and didn't believe any of them all the way. The thing that got me wasn't just that the station knew my name. A lot of jobs know your name. It was that it knew where I was trying to go next. It knew the version of my life I'd been holding on to every time I told myself I could put up with one more shift. I finished that night feeling split in half. One part of me wanted to walk right out, leave the keys on the desk, and let District sort itself out without me. The other part kept circling back to the same hard, stupid point. I was close. Close enough that quitting out of fear felt like letting that place take a piece of my future just by existing. Oh, I hated that. I hated how fast the thought became personal. When I got back to Denise's house, the kitchen light was on. She was sitting there in her robe with a mug in both hands, not looking surprised to see me awake and wired at that hour. I must have looked rougher than I realized because she didn't ask how the shift went. She waited until I sat down, and even then she gave me a minute like she was measuring whether I'd say it on my own. Aunt Denise sat across from me at the table. "You can walk away from a job, Griffin." "Not this close," I told her. She looked at my hands. Close to what? I didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. She didn't push after that, just sat there with the mug between her hands in the kitchen quiet around us. That was Denise. She didn't turn things into speeches. She let them sit until you either picked them up yourself or left them where they were. What I couldn't say out loud was that I no longer knew whether I was staying because I needed the last money or because something in me refused to be run off. Probably both. I was too close to the life I'd been trying to get to, and somehow that was exactly what made me feel exposed. The station wasn't just pressing on the job anymore. It had started pressing on the person I was trying to become once the job was over. I went into the next shift knowing I couldn't keep treating the whole thing like a string of bad calls and bad nerves. I had Milton's old pages in my head. I had that strip from the printer I wished I'd never read. I had the dock, the glass, the rear walk, the wrong numbers, all of it. Not one piece by itself. The order of it. That was what had changed. Once I saw the order, I couldn't unsee it. I got there early on purpose, while there was still enough gray outside to make the marsh look flat and harmless from a distance. Vernon was already inside finishing his notes. He didn't look surprised to see me, just tired. More tired than I'd seen him before, like he'd been expecting this part and hated that it had finally come due. I pulled the old log section from under the desk and laid it next to the current book. I didn't say anything right away. I just opened both to the marked pages and let him look. Milton's shift had the same crooked circles around the south readings. The same short notes where a normal operator would have written more, a mention of the shore light, then those strange dead spots where the timestamps and the handwriting stopped belonging to the same hour. My own pages weren't identical, but they were close enough to make the hair stand up on the back of my neck. Same pressure points, same drift, same parts of the station pushing forward one after another. Vernon stared at the books a long time without touching them. Then he closed the newer one first, like he already knew what it said, and didn't need to punish himself by seeing it again. Vernon finally looked me in the face. It was never about the water. Then what was it about? I asked. He took his time answering. An open shift. He said it plain. No weight on the words, no spooky pause. Just the shortest answer he could give without lying to me anymore. I waited for him to explain it in some way that would let me drag the whole thing back into ordinary language. A paperwork issue. A man who walked off the job. A district screw-up that had turned into a local story because no one wanted to own it. Vernon didn't give me any of that. He told me Milton had been on nights when the south readings started going wrong in the same way mine had. The beacon had gone strange. Pump House 2 had started fogging from inside. District had needed the station kept online and the numbers kept usable, so the work didn't stop just because one shift had started slipping sideways. Milton went out to settle what was off, or almost went out, or got close enough that after a certain point, nobody could say where the job ended and whatever came after began. That was how Vernon talked about it. Never dramatic, never clean. Just enough to let me see the shape without pretending he understood every inch of it himself. He never said Milton died out there. He never said Milton came back wrong. What he said, in the plainest version he had, was that the station never let go of his shift. The entries after a certain point weren't right. The timing wasn't right. The way District had archived that night wasn't right. The man was gone, but the work attached to him never really closed. That was the part that turned the whole thing over in my head. Up to then, I'd been thinking like a person in a horror story without wanting to admit it. Something bad in the marsh, something in the building, something using the dock and the glass and the printer, because that was the shape it had found. But this was colder than that, colder and more specific. The rules were not there to beat anything. They were there to keep the station from processing you as the man who finished what Milton hadn't. The beacon pushed you toward the boards. The wrong south numbers pulled at your instincts. The glass at Pump House 2 made you want to check. The printer tried to make it official. The skiff at the dock was just one more step in the same sequence. Once I saw it that way, everything that had happened changed shape at once. The station didn't need me dead on the walk. It didn't need some big, violent ending. The worst thing it could do was simpler. Get my initials into the wrong places. Get my timestamps tied to the wrong side. Get me acting like a responsible operator long enough to close out the pieces that had been hanging open since Milton. After that, the rest wouldn't even have to make sense in a way a person could explain. I asked Vernon what District had done after Milton vanished, and he gave me the answer I'd already half expected. They kept the place running. Not because they were cruel. Because parishes don't stop needing flood control just because something goes bad in one station. Water still moves. Pumps still have to run. Reports still have to get filed. Systems like that don't leave much room for the kind of event nobody can write up cleanly. I called Marlene from the landline before I could talk myself out of it. I didn't come at her angry. I didn't have the energy for it. I just needed to hear whether she would keep staying on the safe side of the truth or finally stop. She answered on the second ring, sounding exactly the same as always. tired, level, already in the middle of the day she was having whether I liked it or not. Over the line, Marlene said, "We kept South Fork online because the parish needed it." That was farther than she'd gone before, far enough that I felt something in me settle the wrong way. "So you knew," I said. She didn't deny it. Those rules were all we had. That was the thing about Marlene. I couldn't hate her cleanly, because from where she stood, she wasn't defending some campfire story. She was defending continuity, a station that still had to function, records that still had to exist, a patchwork set of rules handed down because nobody had found anything better. That made her worse in a way, but not simple. People keep bad systems going all the time because the alternative costs more than anyone wants to face. When I hung up, Vernon was still standing by the desk with one hand resting near the log. He looked older than usual then, not softer, just worn down around the edges in a way that made it clear he'd been carrying this longer than I'd been alive in that place. He looked toward the printer. "If it starts closing the shift under your name, you stop finishing things for it." That was the first instruction that made the ending of the story visible to me before I got there. Up to then, every rule had been about avoiding, stepping back, not checking, not touching. This was different. It told me what the rules were for, not to keep me safe in the broad, simple sense, to keep me unclaimed, to stop me from doing the last neat, responsible things a worker does at the end of a shift. Once that settled in, I could feel the whole job turning against the habits I'd been raised to trust. Verify the number, match the log to the station, follow through, don't leave a mess for the next person. The more I tried to do the job well, the closer I got to being the one it chose. I sat there after Vernon left, alone with the books open and the room too quiet around me, and I could finally see the sequence for what it was. Wrong south discrepancy. Rear beacon. Pump house 2 whitening up, printer output, dock, handoff, closure. It wasn't random pressure from different corners of the building. It was a path. Milton had gotten put on it, and now I was standing in the same marks. The light outside had dropped fully by then. The room had that late-night feel again, where the station seemed to pull inward around the desk and the panel and the little mechanical sounds you stop hearing until you're alone. I checked the old entries one last time and put them back. My hands were steady, which bothered me more than if they'd been shaking. Then, the beacon blinked once through the crack at the rear curtain, not enough to be anything on its own, just enough to let me know the chain had started. I stood up and moved to the front side instead. The skiff was already there at the dock, tied off neat in the dark like it had every right to be. When I turned back, the printer hadn't moved yet, but the whole room felt like it was waiting on it. That sounds stupid now, but it's the only honest way I know to put it. Everything in there felt arranged around the moment it was about to start. I looked at the log. I looked at the unplugged fear sitting in my own chest. I looked at the panel still pretending this was a normal shift with normal numbers and normal work left to do. And I understood I had exactly one chance left not to let the station sort me into the same place it had kept waiting for Milton. The printer kicked on while I was still bent over the shift log, tired enough to keep losing my place on the page. By then, the room already felt wrong around me. The beacon had started its little two-blink pattern out past the rear curtain. The skiff was sitting at the dock. Pump House 2 had already gone white across the glass once, and I'd looked away before I could make the mistake of checking it again. I knew what was coming before the paper even started moving. The strip fed out in short jerks instead of one clean run. I tore it loose and saw the part that mattered right away. It had the south side marked as verified, and the shift closed under my initials. I just stood there staring at it. I hadn't gone out there. I hadn't taken the last reading. I hadn't closed anything. The station was trying to do the paperwork first and leave me with only one thing left to do, which was act like the man whose name was already on it. The radio crackled at my shoulder. Over the radio, Marlene said, "South Fork, confirm south gauge." That could have been normal on another night. That was what made it bad. Her voice didn't sound possessed or twisted or wrong. It sounded like District doing what District always did. Get the number, close the loop, keep the record clean. The whole place was built on that kind of thinking, and right then I could feel it pressing at me from every side. Verify it, match the log to the station, don't leave a mess behind for the next shift. I looked at the strip in my hand again. The printer had skipped straight past me and written the version of the night it wanted on its own. If I stepped out there now, if I checked the south side, if I fixed the page into something neat and usable, I'd be doing exactly what it had been moving me toward for days. The radio hissed again. I could hear the impatience in the silence around it. I could feel my own breathing too loud in the room. I looked at the torn strip in my hand. No, I said. The word sounded small, but it was the first clean thing I'd done all night. I tore the strip in half and opened the metal drawer too fast. The bent edge of it bit into my palm when I shoved the paper down inside. It wasn't deep, but it was sharp enough to make me jerk back and hiss through my teeth. Blood came up thin across the heel of my hand. Nothing dramatic, just enough to leave a slick red line along the crease of my palm while I yanked the printer plug from the wall. The machine died with a little click. The room didn't. The panel still glowed. The radio still hissed. Somewhere deeper in the building, something shifted through the pipes with a dull metallic thump that made me think of water changing direction. I grabbed the log, flipped to the current page, and stared at the last few entries. My own writing. The circled number. The line waiting under it. Clean space where a responsible operator would have finished what he started. That was the trap. Not fear, not some impossible thing standing in front of me. Just doing the job the way I'd been taught to do it. I tore the page out. The paper fought me harder than it should have because the perforation caught on one corner. My cut hand slipped. The page ripped crooked, leaving a jagged strip still hanging in the binding, which made me pull harder. When it finally came free, the motion sent the edge of the book skidding into the radio and knocked it off the desk. It hit the floor hard enough to burst a blast of static through the speaker before it died. The sound cracked sharp in the small room and left my right ear ringing. I stood there breathing through my mouth with the ripped sheet in one hand and the half-torn strip still in the drawer. Nothing had reached for me. Nothing had banged on the windows. That almost made it worse. The station was still trying to keep this in the language of work. The beacon flashed again behind the curtain. I didn't look toward the rear glass. I knew better than that by then. I took the torn page, folded it once, then shoved it into my jacket pocket. Not because I thought that would fix anything, just because I didn't want it left there for the place to claim back. After that, I went to the rear door, slid the interior lock across, and dropped the bar into place over it. It was an old, simple bar, there to brace the door in bad weather more than anything else. But I wanted one more thing between me and the boards, one more thing that said no. Pump House 2 sat off to the side of the rear walk, close enough that I could feel it in my head even without seeing it. The last time I'd glanced that way, the inspection glass had gone white so evenly it looked like the room inside had been erased. I kept my eyes down and moved fast. Back to the desk. Keys, flashlight, truck keys from my jacket. I took the station keys because leaving them behind felt too much like abandoning a post cleanly. I wasn't closing anything cleanly. The radio on the floor crackled once more, weak and ugly from the impact. Marlene saying something, maybe my name, maybe the station name again. I left it there. On the way out, I passed the front side and made the mistake of glancing through the edge of the curtain. The skiff was still tied at the dock, angled a little different now with the water movement, but the line on it looked too straight, too still, like the boat had shifted without the rope ever giving. I stopped walking for one bad second, then kept going. I didn't touch the light. I didn't go to the window. I didn't give the dock anything more than that. Outside, the air hit me wet and cold. The parking lot gravel sounded too loud under my boots. I got in the truck with my hand leaving a smear on the wheel and my ear still ringing and drove away without looking back at the building. I wish I could tell you there was some final thing in the mirror, some shape at the dock or light on the walk that proved everything cleanly. There wasn't. Just the station lights falling behind me and the dark road opening up ahead. I dropped the keys and the dead radio at the district office the next morning when the front desk opened. I didn't wait for a meeting. I didn't fill out a resignation form. I left them with the woman at the counter, said I was done, and walked back out before anybody could start asking for the version of events I couldn't give them. Then I went home, washed the cut on my palm, and sat at Denise's kitchen table feeling more tired than I'd ever been in my life. Later, at Denise's kitchen table, she looked at the cut on my palm. "You don't ever have to go back." "I know," I said. I meant it. And I didn't go back. I made my program start date. I left Louisiana when I'd planned to leave. I carried the ripped page with me for a week before I burned it in a gas station trash barrel, because I couldn't stand opening a drawer and seeing it there. But a couple days after I quit, I checked the district employee portal to make sure my final hours had posted. My last shift was in the system. Start time. End time. Complete. No discrepancy note, no missing page, no mention that I'd left early, that the radio never came back, that the log had not been closed the way it should have been. It was all there like a clean finished record under my name. The worst part was that the station didn't seem done with my name.